Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome
to Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
Optimal
wellness brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
It's great.
Nice. Okay. Well, you did the reporting for this week's episode, so give me the lowdown. What are we talking about?
So, new guidelines.
Oh, okay. That's pretty vague. New guidelines on what are we talking about?
Okay, drum roll. On alcohol consumption. So,
yes.
The Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction came out for the first time in 12 years. The last guidelines were in 2011.
Wow.
On what's called Canada's Guidance on Alcohol and Health. So, essentially, they reviewed studies that had been done on alcohol over the last 12 years and took another look at what are safe levels of alcohol consumption.
Yes, I recall seeing this in the news, in social media. Like, people are talking about this. It's a big deal.
Because essentially the answer that they came up with was there is no safe level of alcohol consumption, that your risk of incurring an alcohol-caused death starts to go up virtually,
1 drink.
Yeah, 1 drink a week, 2 drinks a week.
Wow.
And then kind of goes up from there. So
that's really different. That's different from like previous recommendations. And even, we talk about diets that recommend wine. Like, this is really different.
I think it's got people wondering a lot of questions, like how much can they drink?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference? Why the change?
I'm a woman, so is it different for me than for you, a man?
The guidelines distill it for people in general, but they also break out the risks for men and women.
That's great. A lot of research is missing that, so I'm excited about that part.
It is. It's interesting. And teasing out the implications is Medcan's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Peter Nord. That's what this episode is all about. I'm Chris.
I'm Jazz. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
So it's an interesting show this week. We spoke to some of the experts who created the guidelines, an epidemiologist and then an MD who has a master's of public health. We also spoke to a historian who disagrees with them. He's a critic of them. To walk through those interviews, I got together with Dr. Peter Nord.
Yes, our wellness host.
Who is so good at, kind of teasing out the implications for regular people.
Yeah.
It
can be hard to wade through that data, that research.
Dr. Nord is just really good at telling you what it means in a way that you find kind of compelling and accessible.
Yeah, and understandable.
And so the two of us, we go through the interviews, and then Dr. Nord kind of brings it all together at the end to tell us what it all means.
All right, amazing. Well, let's bring Dr. Nord in then.
Let's do it. Dr. Nord, how are you today?
Doing great, Chris. It's a great February when you can see the sun.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were one of the people who suggested we do a show about the new alcohol guidelines. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that and about why you thought it was a good idea.
Well, it was a big change. We'd had these guidelines I think, since 2011, so a good 12 years. And they had been pretty static. And for all of our patients that come through the annual health assessment at Medcan, there's some very specific questions about alcohol intake and very specific recommendations that we used at the time based on those guidelines. And when this new study came out, they were radically different and very low. I mean, we're talking going from 7 to 14 drinks per week down to 2. And so lots of questions coming up. We have to change our guidelines at Medcan and educate our doctors about these things. So it was a very big deal.
I imagine you must have received a lot of questions, and I imagine the questions are still coming in. So we spent some time talking to some of the people who actually created these guidelines to get the logic behind them, to get where they're coming from, to get answers to some of the questions that I think Medcan clients have been asking. And why don't we just launch into it? We'll start with these answers and we'll just kind of talk through them in a way that is intended to provide the logic and answer some of the criticisms and maybe post some issues of our own throughout. And then at the end, Dr. Nord, I'm hoping that you can make some conclusions for our listeners that will make these understandable and maybe talk about where to go from here.
Sounds great, Chris.
Okay, so first of all, why don't we start with where these new guidelines came from? And why don't we roll the tape? This is from one of the guideline authors.
the Canadian government, through Health Canada, commissioned CCSA, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions, to convene a bunch of scientists, like 22 of us from, I think, 16 different academic institutions over a couple of years of period to develop these guidelines.
Okay, so that is a MD, MPH. So he also has a Master's of Public Health named Dr. Tim Naimi.
So I'm Tim Naimi. I'm a physician by training. I'm board certified in internal medicine and in pediatrics. And then I did further training in epidemiology at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. My research has always been on alcohol and the effect of alcohol policies. And then a couple of years ago, I moved to Victoria, BC, and I became the director of the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research.
So he's one of the key authors on the guidelines. I think now is probably a good time to talk about what the old guidelines were.
So previously at Medcan, our guidelines were per week, 7 drinks for women, 14 drinks for men. And a drink is a bottle or can of beer, glass of wine, shot of liquor. Pretty much that simple.
So essentially a drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men.
Exactly.
Was that pretty standard?
Yeah, that was very consistent for many years. And there's a bit of a subtext as well in terms of not just your total number of drinks per week, but how many drinks at a setting. So were you having 7 drinks in one day? So binge drinking, that opens up a whole set of risks as well.
So now let's talk about the process that brought us to these new guidelines. The CCSA, the organization that conducted the research and kind of led the effort to develop these new guidelines, took a risk-based approach. So rather than being prescriptive and saying, here is a safe level, what they did was describe the approximate levels of risk that would happen with certain thresholds of drinking.
Our main outcome that we looked at was the relationship between average alcohol consumption, that is how many drinks per day or per week somebody has, and the likelihood of having a premature death caused by alcohol. That was the main outcome. That was sort of the metric around which we based the different risk zones. It's basically your risk of an alcohol-caused death.
Dr. Noor, do you have any take on that kind of risk-based approach?
Yeah, it's not unique. It's very common in epidemiology and in public health to look at risks just generally across a population. And I think that's one of the takeaways that we can get into and maybe unpack a little bit. But when I'm meeting with my patients and they're saying, Doc, what's the risk for me? And I can say, well, I can quote studies, and there was 10,000 people in this study, and of the 10,000, here is the result. And this is Nord's rule of the bell curve. We can say on average, this is what the result was. Here's your risk of dying from a certain behavior. Here's the risk of a drug working, not working. But here's the thing. I don't know where in the bell curve you're going to fall. So are you going to be the 90-year-old grandmother that's been smoking and drinking for 60 years? Or are you going to be the person who, after a year of smoking and drinking, you're going to die of a heart attack, you're going to die of liver cancer? Because that's what happens at the tails of the bell curve. There's some pretty extreme events. And so epidemiologists, they're looking at the average. And so I just don't know if that person sitting in front of me is average or not. We don't know that until we scroll forward 20 or 30 years maybe and say, oh, gosh, I guess I kind of fell around the average or I didn't. There is almost no way to know ahead of time where you're going to fall on that bell curve. That's probably one of the first takeaways when you start to look at these recommendations.
It's so interesting. I mean, the other thing I think we should probably mention is they're looking at risk thresholds. So levels of drinking that correspond to various risk thresholds for alcohol-caused death. That's the term that Dr. Tim Naimi used. The other term they use is lifetime risk of alcohol attributable death. And in these cases, alcohol exists in a causal chain that led to death. You would not have died without the decision to drink the alcohol. However, alcohol may not necessarily have been the thing that killed you. So one parallel to think about here is jaywalking. And so let's say there's a person who makes the decision to jaywalk, and then unfortunately they get hit by a car and die. in that collision. Jaywalking was not the thing that killed them. It was the collision with the car that killed them. But the jaywalking was a contributing causal factor to the death. The person wouldn't have died without the decision to jaywalk. Dr. Nord, I think I'm probably over-explaining this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. We do things every day. We make decisions maybe subconsciously about how much risk we're going to take. You know, the risk of dying in a car accident is a very real thing. Yet we drive the car. Like we put our seatbelt on to try and modify our risk. But even with that, there's a chance that we're going to drive out and get hit by a truck and die. When you look at these studies, alcohol is a carcinogen. It causes all sorts of bad things from a health perspective. And the only way to get that risk down to zero is to drink zero.
For the purpose of the guidelines, the risk-based approach was really important and probably bears a bit of further context. So we're going to get that from Dr. Jürgen Rehm, who's an epidemiologist who studies the harm caused by alcohol. He's a senior scientist at CAMH and is a professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at University of Toronto. And he has a global profile and contributes to World Health Organization reports.
The criterion which has been used here is very simple. It is what is deemed to be the risk which we are willing to tolerate as a society for other risk factors.
What they did was they looked at risk thresholds. Epidemiologists, the people who deal with these, these probabilities in statistics, they go by some rules of thumb. So, for example, involuntary risks. So those are risks that are imposed on us. For example, the risk of death by drinking water. One rule of thumb is that the standard risk threshold on that is a 1 in a million. So a 1 in a million chance of dying from poisoning from drinking water, or, for example, say radon in the home. Voluntary risks are different. So the previous risks were involuntary risks. Voluntary risks, so the risks that come from our choices, the risk threshold that we tolerate on those decisions tend to be around 1 in 1,000. So what they started to look at was, what was the risk threshold that produced a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying from an alcohol attributable cause of death? Here's Professor Jürgen Rehm.
Whenever we do something ourselves, bungee jumping, skiing, drinking, we are way more liberal. When we do something voluntarily, like drinking, we tend to accept risks of 1 in 1,000. That is not only for drinking, this is for activities like that. And so this risk was applied. And then what has been done is a simulation. What happens if somebody, men, women, starts drinking at the legal drinking age and then drinks 1 drink every day on his life, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, 4 drinks, 5 drinks. And that has been simulated through with all of the different outcomes for mortality until 1 in 1,000 risk to die.
So to put that into context, let's look at some other things where the risk is, near 1 in 1,000, higher than 1 in 1,000. Epidemiologists, they're looking at these things all the time. So the risk of dying from getting scalded by hot water, 1 in 133,000. The risk of dying from a dog attack is now down to 1 in 70,000. And so we're getting closer, but we're still way above the risk of 1 in 1,000. So let's go a little farther. The risk of dying from sunstroke, 1 in 6,000. The risk of dying from a bicycle accident, 1 in 3,300. Now we're getting closer. The risk of dying from choking on food, 1 in 2,745 to be specific. And then here we go. We're really getting close to 1,000. And then the risk of death by drowning is 1 in 1,024, to put quite a fine point on it.
So how many drinks per week do you have to drink to hit that 1 in 1,000 voluntary risk threshold?
So to get to that 1 in 1,000, this is the important number, and this is what the studies were looking at. That's the 2 drinks per week to get to 1 in 1,000.
I'm restating this because I want to be sure that I understand this, Dr. Nord. Consuming alcohol at a level of 2 drinks a week puts you, according to the epidemiological risk tables, at about the same risk of dying from an alcohol attributable death, a death in which alcohol was a factor, as dying from drowning.
That's it exactly. One of the themes that this starts to bring up is we'll absorb a certain amount of risk if we're getting a certain amount of benefit from that risk. So I'm willing to take the risk of bungee jumping because it's thrilling. It's fantastic. I get a rush. There's a benefit to that. And so I'm willing to take some risk that's associated with the benefit. And I think that's an important theme that we can come back to as we walk through the rest of the episode.
So what happens above 2 drinks a week?
So above 2 drinks per week, the incidence of all-cause mortality and morbidity or disability starts to increase, and it increases pretty steadily. This is if we're having this number of drinks on average, week on week, for years on years. So we're not talking about folks that drank for a year, 10 years ago. We're talking about the studies were looking at people that were drinking at a very consistent level over a prolonged period of time. And so at that point, we start to really see the health effects of the alcohol. And there's many, the pancreatitis, brain injuries, cirrhosis, and then all the cancers, cancer of liver, stomach, mouth, colon, breast. There's associated injuries and there's violence that's associated with increased levels of alcohol. And these studies were able to tease those out and apply them separately and then roll them together to develop this 2 drink per week, 1 in 1,000 risk.
How much do you have to drink to get to a 1 in 100 chance? So for other points of comparison, so other things that are around a 1 in 100 risk. So dying in a fire or dying from smoke inhalation is a 1 in 450 risk. Risk of death as a pedestrian struck by vehicle is 1 in 500. Risk of dying in a motor vehicle crash is 1 in 100. So as a point of comparison, how much do you have to drink to get to 1 in 100 chance of having an alcohol attributable death? What is that threshold?
So the comparator would be about 6 drinks per week. And again, that's male and female together. And there are differences between men and women and responses to alcohol. But on average, 6 drinks per week. So think about a drink a day is equivalent to the risk of dying in a motor vehicle accident over your lifetime.
That is remarkable. And you said that for women, the old number was 7 drinks a week, and that for men, it was 14 drinks a week. Now I can see why these are causing the hubbub that they have. Now, a level that actually introduces a significant level of risk, this 1 in 100 risk threshold, is only 6 drinks a week. This is reflective of a new understanding.
Absolutely. Just to recap, right? 1 in 1 million and 1 in 1,000. We're down to now 1 in 100. And now we're talking about real risk. That means, 1 person in 100 over their lifetime is going to end up dying from X. And, whether it's motor vehicle crash or a drink a day, that's now within the realm of that's really something we have to think about.
And it's interesting because most of us tolerate that 1 in 100 risk threshold every day. Despite the 1 in 100 risk of dying from a motor vehicle accident, for example, we still strap ourselves into the front seats of our cars and drive down the road.
This is really about informing the population. You need to understand so you can make an informed decision. So you know what your choices are. And so in the past, we were being told a certain amount of risk. Now we're realizing the risk of alcohol is a little greater. Maybe that just informs some choices. If I was to say to you, Chris, like you can have a drink a day, but you're going to take a few years off your lifespan, you might say, you know what? I'll take it. I love drinking. I don't abuse alcohol, but I'm a social drinker. I don't mind a glass of wine with dinner every night and I'll go out and maybe have another glass with friends on the weekend. You know what? If I have to shorten my life by a couple of years, I'm actually okay. And that's where this informed choice, I think, is one of the big takeaways. It is about understanding what that is. For some people, it's like, no, I'm doing everything I can to live longer, not live shorter. I'm going to cut alcohol out completely, or I'm going to do it on a frequency that is below that risk level that I'm comfortable with, whatever that is. And so I think that's an important subtlety that everyone needs to take away from the study.
Dr. Nord, how does that compare to what Canadians actually are drinking? Like, do Canadians drink a lot relative to the rest of the world? Where are we there?
Yeah, as it turns out, we're pretty far down the list, 57th on the list of countries that were looked at. And so that's on average about a drink and a half a day across our population. And again, I'm going to come back to the bell curve. That's the middle of the bell curve. We've got lots of people that don't drink at all. In fact, 25% of Canadians don't drink alcohol at all. And at the other side of that bell curve, we've got people that are drinking a lot and to toxic levels.
So for example, where's the United States? I know you have a son in Ireland. Where's Ireland?
Yeah. So I was fascinated to see that Ireland's number 7. So my son, who's in med school in Ireland, is going to be seeing quite a bit of pathology associated with alcohol intake, which is, good for a medical student because you see a lot of stuff that you can learn from. But if you're part of that population, wow, it's part of that culture. And you asked about the United States, 45, and Canada again is 57.
What's the top place?
The top 3 drinking countries in the world, wait for it, Estonia, Lithuania, and the Czech Republic, all neighbors of each other.
Yeah, I had a trip to the Czech Republic when I was in university, and I can attest to that. So most Canadians are between that 1 and 2 drink per day range, or between 7 and 14 drinks per week. That puts us around the 1 in 100 risk threshold of dying by an alcohol-related cause. Dr. Jürgen Rehm had another way to think about it.
Think about it this way. We have about 2 to 3% of the population dying because of alcohol who would not have died any given year without any alcohol. So the current way we are drinking is more than 1 in 100.
That's interesting because if you look at the report, there are 200 different ways of dying that has some element of alcohol attributable risk.
The alcohol effect on the body has been known for decades, and we've learned even more over the last even 10 years or so. And it has a direct effect on many types of cancers. We tend to think about mouth, throat. Think about where the alcohol is going through your gut. So colon cancer, liver cancer, of course, and breast cancer. It's a carcinogen. So those are really important takeaways, I think.
Here's Dr. Tim Naimi on that.
That's one of the areas where the research has also really evolved quite a bit. So, alcohol is classified as a type 1 carcinogen or cancer-causing chemical by the World Health Organization that's considered causally related to 9 different types of cancers. So the interesting thing for these cancers is the risk starts to increase above 0. So this is one of the areas we want to draw people's attention to. So for women, for example, for every drink that they consume per day on average more, their increased risk of breast cancer is somewhere between 8 and 10%, depending on what study you look at. Now, for women, right, the risk of getting breast cancer in one's lifetime is pretty substantial, right? It depends on what age you take it out to. But let's say it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 for an additional drink per day. So for each 7 drinks per week one consumes additionally, you increase your risk, let's say 10% on top of that. That's a 1% absolute increase in the risk of breast cancer.
Yeah. So in 2017, 18,000 Canadians died because of something directly related to alcohol. And each year we're seeing about 7,000 cases of cancer in Canada. So these are 7,000 people that are diagnosed with cancer that would not have been had it not been for the alcohol effect. And so obviously the corollary of that is removing that alcohol effect is saving 7,000 people having a diagnosis of cancer, and as many as 18,000, and probably more since our population's increased, lives saved. So it's a big burden on our population.
These are sobering statistics, and that's an unintentional pun. But now let's talk about the public reaction, because there has been a lot of discussion about this. Many people may have already seen this, but one man's reaction is pretty telling, I think.
2 drinks a week?
What do you think of that?
Well, that's just not feasible, not in this country. Well, come on, man. 2 drinks a week. What's that going to do for you? I mean, that doesn't even get you through a day. A reasonable amount, if you're at home, you should be able to have like 4 beer. That's just 2 more. I mean, I'll have 6, but 4 is a fair number. But there shouldn't even be guidelines anyway. Why are you going to tell me how much I can drink at home?
So that's a clip from a CHCH interview that happened shortly after the guidelines came out.
Actually, there's a piece in that segment that is true. They're telling us, right? It's like this goes back to somehow it's Big Brother is going to get into my life and affect how I behave and how I drink. And clearly, that's the takeaway here is informed choices. So this group came forward just to let everybody know this is the deal. It's up to you with how you deal with that. You'll have your 4 to 6 beers a day if that's fine, but you should just be informed to know what that means to you and frankly, your family, your loved ones, and all of us as taxpayers when it comes to paying for these health effects at some point.
One of the more informed opinions that objected to these guidelines came from a historian named Dan Malleck, who is a Brock University professor who studies the effects of drug and alcohol prohibitions on societies. He wrote a Globe and Mail op-ed that called The New Approach Reckless.
So I'm Dan Malleck. I'm a professor of medical history in the Department of Health Sciences at Brock University and the director of the Center for Canadian Studies. I'm also the author of Try to Control Yourself, a book on the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, Liquor in the Liberal State, about the development of licensing laws in Canada, and When Good Drugs Go Bad, about the origins of Canada's drug laws.
Dan Malleck has a number of criticisms, so why don't we start with the first one?
Wow, 2 drinks a week is a little. I wanted to look at that, and right away, my eyes were drawn to their list of harms, diseases and harms, where they used relative risk rather than absolute risk. So saying if you drink X number of drinks a week, it can increase your risk by 100%, but not saying what your risk was before that. And so often the risk is much lower. So 100% increase is an increase, but it's not really increasing a lot of risk. So those sorts of things really started to irk me.
So what is it that's actually troubling Professor Malleck about these guidelines?
He's worried that the guidelines are going to create a stigma around alcohol.
Because I'm a historian, I look at, amongst other things, the problems that come about when you build stigma around something like drug prohibition, alcohol restriction. I'm sort of tuned into the fact that what they were doing was creating a lot of stigma or building stigma intentionally so that people would stop drinking. But stigma doesn't always work that way. It also causes people to worry and causes people to get stressed and causes people to do things outside of the public eye, underground drinking, things like that, which we saw in the Victorian period with, say, Victorian women who were not supposed to drink. I mean, heaven forbid, they're the moral center of the home. But when they did, they often did it in secret, and it caused a lot of problems for them, because they were over drinking things like perfume, which has alcohol in it, or stuff like vanilla,
So in the past, and I think this is reflective of some of his comments, there has been this sense that alcohol can be protective, not necessarily from obviously cancer, but maybe from ischemic heart disease and stroke. And that's been something that has been a question that's been thrown back at these regulations, that are these guidelines that have started to be promulgated.
There's a lot of evidence about the benefits of moderate drinking, the cardiovascular health, things like that. And even their data shows this, but they actually don't recognize it in the way they articulate their guidelines. They had to figure out how to massage the data to make the scariest predictions or the scariest statements. And then they kind of blew it because they said something that their data didn't show. And to me, that's a big tell. That says, you guys aren't really being honest with us. You're trying to illustrate a story, but the pictures don't match the story. The data doesn't match your narrative.
Those are pretty serious criticisms. And so we thought it made sense to dig into them a little bit. Dan Malleck mentions the cardiovascular health benefits of small levels of drinking. That's something that's been around for a while, that a glass of wine or so a day actually decreases your risk of dying from ischemic heart disease. And in fact, if you look at the risk tables in the guidelines, and we'll post these on the episode's webpage, if you look at the risk caused by alcohol of ischemic heart disease or stroke, the risk value is actually slightly negative, up to 7 drinks a week. So we checked in about this with guideline co-author, Dr. Tim Naimi.
We didn't ignore that. That's just erroneous because, as you indicate, see those negative numbers indicate a suggestion of protection for those couple of diseases, for example, at very low levels of consumption up to a drink a day. So obviously we didn't ignore those things.
But what is happening there? Like, why is there that decrease?
Honestly speaking, that decrease may be an artifact. One of the, the changes in the science that's happened in the past 15 years is this whole idea that alcohol is kind of good for protecting against heart attacks is kind of falling by the wayside. And we can get into why that is, but it has a lot to do with controlling for those factors that I said are related to alcohol that makes alcohol look good, but not because of the alcohol. Yeah, so that's another big change. So those protective estimates are far lower than they used to be, and they may not exist at all. We don't have the science, but there's another large type of study called genetic randomization studies. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but we didn't actually even consider those for these guidelines. I think they'll be incorporated into the next ones. Those suggest no protection whatsoever for heart disease and stroke, but they don't suggest that benefit even at low levels. So to keep it sort of high level for the audience, that the bloom is sort of off that rose. And even this past year in 2022, the World Heart Federation came out and said that the science behind this idea that alcohol is good for your heart is basically bunk. So we actually do include some protection because we didn't feel comfortable sort of completely ignoring that. But the bloom is sort of off that rose. Another bad metaphor, but scientifically.
Dr. Peter Nord, what are your thoughts on all of this?
So when we look at the studies over the last couple of decades, looking at alcohol specifically as to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, ASCVD, we've talked about that in other episodes, and we look at the effect on the arteries. So these are arteries all over your body. Of course, we're really concerned about arteries in the heart and arteries in the brain. And we recognize that more recently, the benefits, which previously were a bit on the almost anecdotal side. We look at certain cultures that have lots of red wine and we know the Mediterranean diet that goes with that, and everyone's living longer. And we're recognizing now that we sort of talked ourselves into it. Actually, it might have been the Mediterranean diet that was counteracting the effect of the red wine more than it was the red wine itself in isolation was going to create this benefit. And that's the real difficulty. How do you pull out the positive or negative benefit of, let's say, red wine when we have all these confounding variables like the diet, like exercise, like stress levels that affect our overall health and cardiovascular health? To actually tease out some of those variables, we're recognizing that, as we're hearing, the benefit is very questionable.
The other big criticism that has been out there that we both heard about is that the CCSA guidelines were put together by people who are ignoring the life-improving benefits of alcohol. So this take is basically humans are social animals. Having strong social ties can help us live longer. And alcohol can, for some people, help make them more social. Dr. Nord, what do you think of this social, alcohol is social, and depriving people of alcohol makes life less fun and may actually harm lifespan?
I think there's probably something there. I think, when we look at these studies, again, this is a meta-analysis of so many different studies. I think that would have come out in the end, right? They're looking at thousands and thousands of people, all the pluses and minuses, alcohol plus or minus to these different variables. I have a feeling that the socialization benefit, the good social aspects, the relaxation, the fun factor, that's a real thing. But I have a feeling that was also picked up by the studies. It's not like you can carve that out as a variable. It's one of the many variables that rolled in together. And I'd say the benefit to a population of the fun factor is not going to be significant in outweighing the negative effects on the health of a population. I think it's a separate question. I think the question is what we talked about earlier, and it's about informed choices. And as long as we know that we're going out, we're having fun, we're enjoying ourselves, yeah, there's a bit of a risk to that. And before we were saying, hey, I can have like 14 drinks a week and I'm good. And now it's like, maybe it's more like 2 drinks. And is that going to affect when you go out and have fun? Maybe you don't need to have 4 beers or 6 beers. Maybe it's 1 beer. That's going to be good enough. And we're still going to have fun. Like, do we need to have alcohol in our system to have fun? And I get it. Like, wine and cheese, fantastic together. Wine makes the dinner taste better. I totally get all of that stuff. And we're not saying that'll never happen. It's just that people need to understand the risks that they're taking and make informed choices.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And Dr. Nord, that was a wonderful segue into what Dr. Jürgen Rehm also said.
Life is about choices. Fun, in the case of alcohol, has some consequences. Everybody, you, me, must make this choice that is not against fun, that is just for a more rational way how we deal with the risk in life. This is about to be clear as a consumer who knows what life is entailing. Okay, these are consequences. And if I do this and this behavior, then I have this risk. Is it sure that I die prematurely? No. There's always the old grandmother who had been smoking for 60 years and hasn't died, and she's now 105. That is something which is individual. We can only make statistics for society. But still, I would see it more like informing society and our members of the potential consequences of their behavior.
It's so interesting. Dr. Nord, you made reference to the 90-year-old grandmother earlier, which is so funny. She comes up so often when you're talking to epidemiologists about their studies.
To wrap up, Chris, we just want to make sure that everybody's informed, whether it's Canadians or Medcan clients. I think the big theme is informed choices. Not saying to give up alcohol, but if you do, there's going to be a health benefit to you. And your odds are going to be better that you can have a longer and healthier life, the less alcohol that you take into your system. And it means risk-benefit analysis on a personal level. That could be. I think the second takeaway is the law of large numbers and the bell curve. We always need to take that away and really think about when we see the results of very large population-based studies, remember that that's an average, and it's very difficult prospectively to know where each of us lies on the bell curve. And again, maybe genetics can predict a little bit. We can certainly, at Medcan, we're checking biomarkers all the time. And based on all that information, we can potentially say where you're going to fall in the bell curve. But honestly, there's no perfect answer on that one. The real takeaway is alcohol is a carcinogen, and smoking is a carcinogen. Alcohol is a carcinogen. And so the only way to have zero risk, again, is zero intake for us, when we recognize now that really any alcohol intake is going to cause some degree of risk for mortality and morbidity. And it's up to us to make that call. And again, for us, we've got physicians that are up to speed with all of this stuff and are willing to have a very detailed conversation about these kind of informed choices. We're here to inform. We're really appreciative of the CCSA and this information that's coming down, and whether it goes any further in terms of labels on alcohol, just like we've had labels on cigarette packages for some time, remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, I think getting the word out that the healthiest way forward is to minimize our alcohol intake. Doesn't get any simpler than that.
And life is about triaging risk on some level. And we balance risk every single day with that decision, whether to jaywalk, whether to ride a motorcycle, whether to put on a seatbelt, wear a helmet when we're riding a bicycle. These are all decisions that we make that is a balance of risks. And once again, alcohol is no different.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norm.
Great to see you again, Chris.
That was Medcan's Chief Medical Officer and our wellness host, Dr. Peter Nord, and he was chatting with you, Chris. You're the executive producer of Eat, Move, Think.
The episode also featured Dr. Tim Naimi. He's an MD and a Master's of Public Health, director of the University of Victoria's Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research.
Also featured Dr. Dan Malleck. He's a health sciences professor at Brock University, an expert in alcohol and drug policy, and a best-selling author.
And Dr. Jürgen Rehm, professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto and senior scientist at CAMH.
We'll post episode highlights and links that you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com. That includes the final report we've been discussing, as well as several different breakdowns of what that report really means for Canadians.
And we'll also post the risk tables for men and women that breaks down types of cancer, tuberculosis, like it goes road injuries.
Yeah, it gets really detailed in there.
And tells you if you drink this amount, then your risk goes up this amount. It's really interesting to look at, actually. Follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell.
Say hello, send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com and tell us what you think about the report.
Eat, Move, Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertin, Andrew Imex, and Emily Bozek.
We already gave your title, Chris, but
I got a lot
you're executive producer.
Got a lot of play here.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
See you soon. This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.